Now recognize Ranking Member Nunes or Minority Counsel for 45 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, welcome. I want to just establish a few basic facts about your knowledge, Ukraine, Burisma, and the role of the Bidens.
Yes, sir.
You spend an extraordinary amount of your time on Ukraine, correct? Ukraine
is one of the countries in my portfolio. I would not say an extraordinary amount of time, but certainly the Vice President has engaged on Ukraine policy quite a bit in my 8 months.
And it's in your portfolio?
That's correct.
First off, were you aware in September of 2015, then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, publicly called for an investigation into Zlochevsky, the president of Burisma. Were you aware of these public statements?
No, not at the time.
You are today, though.
I've since heard them, yes.
Did you know of anti-Trump efforts by various Ukrainian officials as well as Alexander Chalupa, a DNC consultant?
No, I was not aware.
Did you know about the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Kent's concerns about potential conflict of interest into Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
I did not work on Ukraine policy during that time frame, so I've become aware of it through...
in the last year or so?
I've become aware of it through Mr. Kent's testimony through this process.
Did you know that financial records show a Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to American accounts tied to Hunter Biden?
No, I was not aware.
Until you prepared for this hearing?
Until others have been testifying in more detail on those issues, that's correct.
You've been following it more closely?
Correct.
Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after Vice President Biden forced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
Again, sir, I was not working on Ukraine policy during that time. So
yeah, and none of these are trick questions. I'm just trying to get through them.
I understand.
Yeah. Did you know that Burisma lawyers pressured the State Department in February 2016 after the raid and month before the firing of Shokin, and that they invoked Hunter Biden's name as a reason to intervene?
I was not aware.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016 after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
Not at the time. Again, I've become aware of that through this proceeding.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I'm going to ask you same questions just to establish some basic facts about your knowledge about Ukraine, Burisma, and the role of the Bidens. In September 2015, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, publicly called for an investigation into Zlochevsky, the president of Burisma. Were you aware of these public statements?
I wasn't aware of them at the time.
When did you become aware of them?
During the course of the testimony and the depositions after this impeachment inquiry began.
Did you know of anti-Trump efforts by various Ukrainian government officials as well as Alexander Chalupa, a DNC consultant?
I'm not aware of any of these interference efforts.
Did you know about Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Kent's concerns about potential conflict of interest with Hunter Biden sitting on the board of Burisma?
The only thing I'm aware of is pertains to his deposition.
Did you know that financial records show a Ukrainian natural gas company, Burisma, routed more than $3 million to the American accounts tied to Hunter Biden?
I'm not aware of this fact.
Until recently.
I guess I didn't independently look into it. I'm just not aware of what kind of payments Mr. Biden may have received. This is not something I'm aware of.
Did you know that Burisma's American legal representatives met with Ukrainian officials just days after Vice President Biden forced the firing of the country's chief prosecutor?
I'm not aware of these meetings.
Did you know that Burisma lawyers pressured the State Department in February 2016 after the raid and a month before the firing of Shokin, that they invoked Hunter Biden's name as a reason to intervene?
I'm not aware of any of these facts.
Did you know that Joe Biden called Ukrainian President Poroshenko at least 3 times in February 2016 after the president and owner of Burisma's home was raided on February 2nd by the state prosecutor's office?
I'm aware of the fact that President Biden, or Vice President Biden, was very engaged on Ukraine and had numerous engagements. That's what I'm aware of.
Ms. Williams and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, as you may or may not know, this committee has spent nearly 3 years conducting various investigations, starting with the Russia collusion hoax, FISA abuse, Democratic hysteria over the lack of collusion in the Mueller report, and now this impeachment charade. One of the most concerning things regarding all of these investigations is the amount of classified or otherwise sensitive information I read in the press that derive either from this committee or sources in the administration. To be clear, I'm not accusing either one of you of leaking information. However, given that you are the first witnesses who actually have some firsthand knowledge of the president's call by listening in on July 25th, it's imperative to the American public's understanding of the events that we get a few matters out of the way first. Ms. Williams, let me just go to you first. For the purposes of the following questions, I'm only asking about the time period from July 25th to September 25th.
Okay.
Did you discuss the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky or any matters associated with the phone call with any members of the press?
No.
To be clear, you never discussed these matters with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, CNN, or any other media outlet?
No, I did not.
Did you ask or encourage any individual to share the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
I did not.
Do you know of any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
No, I do not.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, the same questions for you. Did you discuss the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky or any matter associated with the phone call with any member of the press?
I did not.
Just to be clear, you did not discuss this with the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, CNN, or any other media outlet?
I did not.
Did you ask or encourage any individual to share the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
I did not.
Do you know of any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
We have an NSC press shop, and they field any of these types of questions. I do not engage with the press at all.
Let me ask the question again. Do you know of any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
We have an NSC press shop whose job is to engage on any of these types of questions. I am not aware, but it is possible and likely that the press shop would field these types of questions.
Right, but the question is,
I'm sorry.
The question is, do you know any individual, do you personally know any individual who discussed the substance of the July 25th phone call or any matter associated with the call with any member of the press?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for clarifying. I do not.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, did you discuss the July 25th phone call with anyone outside the White House on July 25th or July 26th, and if so, with whom?
No, I did not discuss the call with anyone outside or inside the White House.
Ms. Williams, during your time on the NSC, have you ever accessed a colleague's work computer without their prior authorization or approval?
I have not, and just to clarify, I'm in the Office of the Vice President, so not on the NSC.
Right, but representing
No, I
the
have
Vice
not.
President.
No.
Thank you for that clarification. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, did you discuss the July 25th phone call with anyone outside the White House on July 25th or the 26th? And if so, with whom?
Yes, I did. My core function is to coordinate U.S. government policy, interagency policy, and I spoke to 2 individuals with regards to providing some sort of readout of the call.
Two individuals that were not in the White House.
Not in the White House, cleared U.S. government officials with appropriate need to know.
And what agencies were these officials with?
Department of State, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, who is responsible for the portfolio Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, and a individual from the office of an individual in the intelligence community.
As you know, the intelligence community has 17 different agencies. What agency was this individual from?
If I could interject here, we don't want to use these proceedings.
It's our time,
I know,
Mr. Chair.
but we need to protect the whistleblower.
Please stop.
I want to make sure that there's no effort to out the whistleblower through the use of these proceedings. If the witness has a good faith belief that this may reveal the identity of the whistleblower, that is not the purpose that we are here for, and I want to advise the witness accordingly.
Mr. Vindman, you testified in your deposition that you did not know the whistleblower.
Ranking member, it's Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, please.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you testified in the deposition that you did not know who the whistleblower was or is.
I do not know who the whistleblower is. That is
So how is it possible for you to name these people and then out the whistleblower?
Per the advice of my counsel, I've been advised not to answer specific questions about members of the intelligence community.
Are you aware that this is the Intelligence Committee that's conducting an impeachment hearing?
Of course I am.
Wouldn't the appropriate place for you to come to testify would be the Intelligence Committee about someone within the intelligence community?
Ranking member, per the advice of my counsel and the instructions from the chairman, I've been advised not to provide any specifics on who I have spoken to inside the intelligence community. What I can offer is that these were properly cleared individuals, or was a properly cleared individual with a need to know.
Well, this is, I mean, you can plead the fifth, but you're here to answer questions, and you're here under subpoena. So you can either answer the question or you can plead the fifth.
Excuse me. On behalf of my client, we are following the rule of the committee, the rule of the chair with regard to this issue, and this does not call for an answer that is invoking the fifth or any theoretical issue like that. We're following the ruling of the chair.
Counselor, what ruling is that?
If I could interject, counsel is correct. Whistleblower has the right, statutory right to anonymity. These proceedings will not be used to out the whistleblower.
And I've advised my client accordingly, and he's going to follow the ruling of the chair. If there's an alternative or you want to work something out with the chair, that's up to you, Mr. Nunes.
Well, we've attempted to subpoena the whistleblower to sit for a deposition. The chair has tabled that motion and then has been unwilling to recognize those motions over the last few days of this impeachment inquisition process. Well, that I'll go to Mr. Castor.
Thank you, Ranking Member Nunes. The call transcript as published on September 25th is complete and accurate. Will both of you attest to that, Ms. Williams?
I didn't take a word-for-word accounting. When I first saw the publicly released version, it looked substantively correct to me.
And Colonel Vindman?
I think I certainly would describe it as substantively correct.
I think in your testimony, your deposition, you said very accurate?
Correct.
Okay. And you flagged a couple edits, Colonel Vindman. I think you had Burisma on page 4. Where President Zelensky was talking about the company mentioned in the issue?
I'm sorry, could you say that question
I believe
again?
in your testimony you explained that you offered an edit that on page 4 of the transcript that was ultimately published, you thought President Zelensky mentioned the word Burisma.
Oh, I had it in my notes. I know that's what he said, yes.
Okay. And Ms. Williams, and that was on page 4, correct?
Correct.
And Ms. Williams, I believe, after your deposition, you went back and checked your notes, and you had President Zelensky using the term charisma as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But that came up on a different part of the transcript than what Colonel Vindman was relating to, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
Yours came up on page 5, and it would have been in substitution for the word case?
That's right. That's where I have it in my notes.
Okay. Colonel Vindman, we've had some discussion earlier today and also at your deposition about whether the president had a demand for President Zelensky. And, you know, I suggested to you in the deposition that the president's words are in fact ambiguous. And he uses some phrases that certainly could be characterized as hedging. On page 3, in the first paragraph, he talks about whatever you can do. He talks about if that's possible. On page 4, he mentions if you could speak to him. He's talking about the Attorney General or Rudy Giuliani. And then at the end of the first paragraph on page 4, he says whatever you can do. The president also says, you know, if you can look into it. And I asked you during your deposition whether you saw or acknowledged the fact that certain people could read that to be ambiguous.
And I said, correct, yes.
And I believe you said, I think people want to hear what they have already preconceived. Is that what you testified?
Actually, if I could ask for just a page cite,
256.
256
Yeah.
and a line. Thank you. Just a minute, please.
And
Just a minute, please. Okay, we got the page.
okay. And then you went on to say, yeah, you agreed with me. You said, yeah, I guess you could interpret it different ways. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Turning attention to the preparation of the transcript, that followed in the ordinary process, correct?
So I think it followed the appropriate process in terms of making sure that eventually it came around for clearances, for accuracy,
Okay.
but it was in a different system, so.
Well, I'll get to that in a second. That relates to the storage of it. You had some concerns. Mr. Morrison articulated his concerns about if the transcript was leaked out. And I think both you and Mr. Morrison agreed that it needed to be protected.
Just a correction. I don't think it was Mr. Morrison. It was Mr. Eisenberg, right?
Mr. Morrison testified at his deposition.
Okay, we don't have that in front of us. If you can give us that, we'll take a look.
Yeah, I think in this, but I could say for myself, there were,
Okay.
the concerns about leaks seemed valid, and I wasn't particularly critical. I thought this was sensitive, and was not going to question
Okay.
the attorney's judgment on that.
Right. And even on the code word server, you had access to it.
Yes.
So at no point in time during the course of your official duties were you denied access to this information?
Correct.
Is that correct? Ms. Williams, I want to turn to you for a moment. And you testified that you believe the transcript is complete and accurate, other than the one issue you mentioned?
Yes, substantively accurate, yes.
Now, did you express any concerns to anyone in your office about what you heard on the call?
My supervisor was listening on the call as well, so because he had heard the same information, I did not feel a need to have a further conversation with him about it.
And you never had any concerns with anyone else in the Vice President's office?
I did not discuss the call further with anyone
Okay.
in the Vice President's office.
Okay, so you didn't flag it for the Chief of Staff or the Vice President's counsel or anyone of that sort?
Again, my immediate supervisor, Lieutenant General Kellogg, was in the room with me.
Right.
so.
And after the call, did you and General Kellogg ever discuss the contents of the call?
We did not, no.
Okay. Now, in the run-up to the meeting in Warsaw, the Vice President was meeting with President Zelensky September 1st in Warsaw. You were involved with the preparation of the Vice President's briefing materials?
I was.
And did you flag for the Vice President this parts of the call that had concerned you?
No, we did not include the call transcript in the trip briefing book. We don't normally include previous calls in trip briefing books.
And so I'm just wondering if the concerns were so significant, how come nobody on the Vice President's staff at least alerted him to the issue that President Zelensky might be on edge about something that had been mentioned on the 725 call?
Again, my supervisor had been in the call with me, and I ensured that the Vice President had access to the transcript in the moment on that day. As we were preparing for the September meeting with President Zelensky, the more immediate issue at hand was 2 days prior, the news had broken about the hold on the security assistance. So we were much more focused on the discussion that was likely to occur about the hold on security assistance for that meeting.
And to your recollection, you were in the meeting with President Zelensky and Vice President Pence?
I was.
And Burisma didn't come up, or the Bidens, or
No.
any of these investigations?
No, I did not.
Colonel Vindman, you testified that the president has well-standing or long-standing concerns about corruption in Ukraine, correct?
I don't recall, but there are concerns. There are broad concerns about corruption, yes.
But you would agree that if the U.S. is giving hundreds of millions of dollars to a foreign nation that has a corruption problem, that's certainly something that the U.S. government officials and the president would want to be concerned about?
Yes.
And if a foreign country has a problem with oligarchs taking money, taking U.S. taxpayer dollars, that's something that the president ought to be concerned about in advance of dispensing the aid?
Yes.
And I believe you did testify that corruption is endemic in Ukraine?
Correct.
Are you also aware of the president's skepticism of foreign aid generally?
I am.
And it's something that he's made part of his priorities to make sure that U.S. foreign aid is spent wisely?
That is correct.
And you're also aware the president has concerns about burden sharing among our allies?
Yes.
And with respect to Ukraine, he was very interested and engaged in seeing if there was a possibility for our European allies to step up and contribute more?
Yes, I think that would be in the context of military assistance. In terms of burden sharing, the European Union provides over $15 billion.
Okay.
Has provided since 2014.
Okay, but you are aware of the president's concern of burden sharing, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Turning our attention specifically to the company of Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky, the co-founder of Burisma, it's one of Ukraine's largest natural gas producers, correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
And it's been subject to numerous investigations over the years.
I'm not aware of, I guess I couldn't point to specific investigations, but there is what I would call a pattern of questionable dealings and questions about corruption.
Zlochevsky had served as the Minister of Ecology during President Yanukovych's tenure?
I came to learn that that is correct, yes.
And are you aware, and George Kent testified a little bit about this last week, that under the Obama administration, the U.S. government encouraged Ukraine to investigate whether Zlochevsky used his government position to grant himself or Burisma exploration licenses? Are you aware of that?
I would defer to George Kent. He's a fount of knowledge on Ukraine, much deeper knowledge than I have. Okay. And if he attested to that, then I'd take his word for it.
And he testified that the U.S., along with the United Kingdom, was engaged in trying to recoup about $23 million in taxpayer dollars from Zlochevsky and the Burisma entity?
I understand he testified that, yes. Correct.
Okay. And Mr. Kent also testified that the investigation was moving along, and then all of a sudden there was a bribe paid, and the investigation went away. Did you hear him mention that?
I heard him mention that. Okay. These are events that occurred before my time, so frankly, beyond what he said, I don't know much more.
Fair enough. Right around the time the bribe was paid, the company sought to bolster their board. Are you aware that they tapped some luminaries for their corporate board?
Certainly, I learned that at some point, yes.
Including the president of Poland, I believe?
Yes.
And Hunter Biden?
Yes, I came to learn that as well.
And are you aware of any specific experience Hunter Biden has in the Ukrainian corporate governance world?
I don't know much about Mr. Hunter Biden.
And we talked a little bit about, at your deposition, about whether Mr. Biden was qualified to serve on this board. And you know, I believe you acknowledged that apparently he was not, in fact, qualified?
As far as I can tell, he didn't seem to be, but like I said, I don't know his qualifications.
Okay. And Ms. Williams, I want to turn our attention to the inaugural trip.
Okay.
At one point, the Vice President and the Vice President's office was focusing on attending that, correct?
That's right.
And it's somewhat complicated because, as I understand it, the White House doesn't want the President and the Vice President to be out of the country at the same time.
Yes, that's correct.
And during the time frame, the President was in Japan. I believe he was in Japan May 24th to 28th. And then he returned to Europe for the D-Day ceremonies, June 2nd to 7th. And I think you told us that there was a window you provided of 4 days at the end of May, that if the Vice President was going to attend the inauguration, it had to be the 29th, 30th, 31st, or 1st?
Our embassy in Kyiv had been in discussions with the Ukrainian, with President Zelensky's team. And as we had learned, obviously, the Ukrainian parliament was not going to come back into session until mid-May, and so we wouldn't know formally what the date would be. But we understood that the initial thinking was that they were looking at dates at the end of May. And so honing in on that time frame, we were aware of President Trump's planned travel on either end. And so that's why we advised the Ukrainians that if Vice President Pence were to be able to participate, the only really available days would be May 30th, May 31st, or June 1st.
Okay. And before the Vice President travels to a foreign nation, you have to send the Secret Service, do advance work, book hotels, and it's a relatively involved preparation experience, right?
That's correct.
And do you know if the Secret Service ever deployed, booked hotels or anything of that sort?
My understanding is that our advance team was looking into those preparations, including hotel availability, and we were trying to determine when it would be appropriate to send out Secret Service and other advanced personnel in order to lay groundwork for a trip. But because we weren't sure yet when the date would be, we hesitated to send those officials out.
But ultimately, the Secret Service, as I understand it, did not deploy.
I don't believe they did, no.
Okay. And the President Zelensky's inauguration was May 20th, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, that's correct.
And you had about 4 days' notice?
In the end, the Ukrainian parliament decided on May 16th to set the date for May 20th. That's correct.
So you would acknowledge that that made it quite difficult for the Vice President and the whole operation to mobilize and get over to Ukraine, correct?
It would have been, but we had already stopped the trip planning by that point.
And when did that happen?
Stopping the trip planning?
Yeah.
On May 13th.
Okay. And how did you hear about that?
I was called by a colleague in the Vice President's Chief of Staff's office and told to stop the trip planning.
Okay. And as I understand it, it was the assistant to the Chief of Staff?
That's correct. Okay.
And so you didn't hear about it from General Kellogg or the Chief of Staff or?
Correct.
Or the President or the Vice President? You heard about it from Mr. Short's assistant?
That's right.
And did you have any knowledge of the reasoning for stopping the trip?
I asked my colleague why we should stop trip planning and why the Vice President would not be attending, and I was informed that the President had decided the Vice President would not attend the inauguration.
Okay. But do you know why the President decided?
No, she did not have that information.
Okay. And ultimately, the Vice President went to Canada for a USMCA event.
That's right.
During this this window of time, correct?
Correct.
So it's entirely conceivable that the President decided that he wanted the Vice President to go to Canada on behalf of USMCA instead of doing anything else, correct?
I'm really not in a position to speculate what the motivations were behind the President's decision.
Well, you know the Vice President's done quite a bit of USMCA events, correct?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Okay. And are you aware of whether anyone at the State Department inquired with your office about the Vice President's availability for the trip to Canada?
For the trip, at what point?
Early May, maybe May 8th.
I was not involved in the trip planning for Canada. Mm-hmm. One of my colleagues who covers Western Hemisphere was in charge of that, so I'm not aware of specific requests about the Vice President's availability. I was aware from my colleague who was planning that trip that we had competing trips potentially for the same window, but I was told that the Ukraine trip would take priority.
Okay, but ultimately you don't know?
I don't know about the Canada trip?
You don't know the reason as to why the vice president was sent to Canada for a USMCA event instead of going to the Ukraine?
I would say I don't know the reason behind why the president directed the vice president not to go to Ukraine. I can't speak to the motivations or about the Canada trip.
Okay. Colonel Vindman, I'd like to turn a little bit to the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office and the subsequent post-meeting in the wardroom. Who all was in the July 10th meeting, to the best of your recollection?
Are we talking about the wardroom, or are we talking about the actual meeting with Ambassador Bolton?
We'll start with the first meeting in the ambassador's office.
So from the U.S. side, we had Ambassador Bolton, Dr. Hill. I believe there was another a special assistant to the president, Wells Griffith was in there, and myself from the Ukrainians.
Who from the Ukrainians? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, for the Ukrainian side, we had Alexander Danyaluk, Andriy Yermak, and I think Alexander Danyaluk's advisor, Alexei Semeny.
Okay. And you testified that you couldn't recall exactly why Ambassador Bolton stopped the meeting short, and you only learned it subsequently when talking to Dr. Fiona Hill?
Yeah, I noted that, it ended abruptly, but I didn't, frankly, I didn't exactly know why.
And in the Bolton meeting, you don't remember Ambassador Sondland using the word Biden?
He did not,
Okay.
to the best of my recollection. I don't think he did.
And then the group decamped to take a photo, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the general feeling of the group was a positive one at that time, even though it may have ended abruptly.
I think Ambassador Bolton was exceptionally qualified. He understood the strategic communications opportunity of having a photo, and we prompted him to before we completely adjourned, to see if he was willing to do a photo, and he did.
Okay, so you went out to West Executive Ave or wherever in the White House and you took a photo. I think you said you took it?
I certainly took a couple of them, yes.
Okay. And in the photo is Secretary Perry, Ambassador Bolton, Ambassador Volker,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Mr. Daniluk, and Mr. Yarmark?
Yes, and I apologize. When I was running through the U.S. side, of course, Ambassador Bolton, Volker, and Sondland were there, and Secretary Perry was there.
Okay. Now, you testified that before the July 10th meeting, you had developed concerns about the narrative, involving Rudy Giuliani. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And had you heard like a firsthand account from anyone on the inside, or had you just been following news accounts?
So I certainly was following news accounts, and that's from the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian press, and U.S. press.
Okay.
And my colleagues in the interagency also were concerned about this, as this had started in the March timeframe, kind of emanating from the John Solomon story all the way through. So there had been ongoing conversations, so several different sources, Counsel.
Okay. And so when Ambassador Sondland mentioned the investigations, you sort of had a little bit of a clue of what the issue was?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. And then you took the photo, a very nice photo, and then you went to the wardroom?
Correct.
And do you remember, I think you conceded to us that you had a hard time remembering exactly what was said in the wardroom. Again, it's 4 months ago. It's hard to be precise about whether Sondland, what specific words he used, whether he used Burisma, 2016 investigations.
Yeah, so I believe it's in the deposition, the three elements, Burisma, Biden's, and the 2016 elections were all mentioned.
In the wardroom?
Correct.
I think we can maybe go back to this, but I think on page 64 of your testimony, you told us that you don't remember him using 2016 in the wardroom?
I believe that I actually followed up, and because this question was asked multiple times, I said that all three elements were in there, so.
Okay,
maybe
so
you picked out
when we asked the question, it sort of refreshed your recollection?
Yes, I guess that's a term now.
There was some discussion of, whether when Mr. Morrison took over the portfolio for Dr. Hill, whether you were sidelined at all. Did you feel like you were?
So I certainly was excluded or didn't participate in the trip to Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus at the end of August. And I wasn't initially, before it changed from a POTUS trip to a vice president trip to Warsaw, I wasn't participating in that one. So I didn't miss that, no.
Okay. Did you express any concerns to Mr. Morrison about why you weren't included on those trips?
So Mr. Morrison, I was on leave. I was supposed to be on leave from the 3rd of August through about the 16th or so of August. And he called me and asked me to return. There was obviously high priority travel to the region. He needed my assistance to help plan for it. And in asking me to return early from leave, which I take infrequently, I assumed that I'd be going on the trip. So when I was, after returning from leave early, when I was told I wasn't going, I inquired about it, correct.
Okay. And what feedback did he give you?
He initially told me that the aircraft that was acquired, the Mil Air, was too small and there wasn't enough room.
Had you ever had any discussions with Mr. Morrison about concerns that he or Dr. Hill had with your judgment?
Did I ever have any conversations with Mr. Morrison about it? No.
Okay. Did Mr. Morrison ever express concerns to you that he thought maybe you weren't following the chain of command in all instances?
He did not.
And did Dr. Hill or Mr. Morrison ever ask you questions about whether you were trying to access information outside of your lane?
They did not.
And another, aspect of the Ukraine portfolio that you were not a part of were some of the communications Mr. Morrison was having with Ambassador Taylor.
Correct.
And did you ever express concern that he was leaving you off those calls?
Well, certainly it was concerning. He had just come on board. He didn't have the, he wasn't steeped in all the items that we were working on, including the policy that we developed over the preceding months. And I thought I could contribute to that, to the performance of his duties.
Okay. When you went to Ukraine for the inauguration?
Correct.
May 20th. At any point during that trip, did Mr. Daniluk offer you a position of defense minister with the Ukrainian government?
He did.
And how many times did he do that?
I believe it was 3 times.
And do you have any reason why he asked you to do that?
I don't know, but every single time I dismissed it. Upon returning, I notified my chain of command and the appropriate counterintelligence folks about the offer.
I mean, Ukraine's a country that's experienced a war with Russia. Certainly their Minister of Defense is a pretty key position for the Ukrainians. President Zelensky, Mr. Daniluk, to bestow that honor on you, at least asking you. I mean, that was a big honor, correct?
I think it would be a great honor, and frankly, I'm aware of service members that have left service to help nurture the developing democracies in that part of the world, certainly in the Baltics. Former officers, and if I recall correctly, it was an Air Force officer that became Minister of Defense. But I'm an American. I came here when I was a toddler, and I immediately dismissed these offers, did not entertain them.
When he made this offer to you initially, did you leave the door open? Was there a reason that he had to come back and ask a second and third time, or was he just trying to convince you?
Yeah, Counsel, you know what? It's the whole notion is rather comical that I was being asked to consider whether I'd want to be the Minister of Defense. I did not leave the door open at all.
Okay.
But it is pretty funny for a Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Army, which really is not that senior, to be offered that illustrious a position.
When he made this offer to you, was he speaking in English or Ukrainian?
Oh, Mr. Daniluk is a absolutely flawless English speaker who's speaking in English.
Okay.
And just to be clear, there were 2 other staff officers, Embassy Kiev staff officers that were sitting next to me when this offer was made.
Okay.
Yeah.
And who were they?
So one of them you may have met, it was Mr. David Holmes, and the other one was, I don't know, I mean, I guess it's another Foreign Service officer, Keith Bean.
Okay. Yeah, we met Mr. Holmes last Friday evening.
I understand. He's a delightful fellow.
And you said when you returned to the United States, you papered it up, given your with SCI clearance. Whenever a foreign government makes a overture like that, you paper it up and you tell your chain of command.
I did, but I also don't know if I fully entertained it as a legitimate offer. I was just making sure that I did the right thing in terms of reporting, yes.
Okay. And did any of your supervisors, Dr. Hill at the time, or Dr. Kupperman or Ambassador Bolton ever follow up with you about that? It's rather significant.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians offered you the post of defense minister. Did you tell anyone in your chain of command about it?
After I spoke to, and I believe the deputy, our deputy senior director, John Areth, was there. Once I mentioned it to both of them, I don't believe there was ever a follow-up discussion.
Okay. So it never came up with Dr. Kupperman or Dr. Hill?
Following that conversation I had with Dr. Hill, I don't believe there was a subsequent conversation, and I don't recall ever having a conversation with Dr. Kupperman about it.
Okay. And did you brief Director Morrison when he came on board?
No, I completely forgot about it.
Okay. And subsequent to the May trip, did Mr. Danny Luke ever ask you to reconsider? Were there any other offers?
No.
When he visited for the July 10th meeting with Ambassador Bolton, did it come up again?
It never came up again.
Okay. And did you ever think that possibly if this information was, got out, that it might create at least the perception of a conflict, that the Ukrainians thought so highly of you to offer you the defense ministry post, on one hand, but on the other hand, you're responsible for Ukrainian policy at the National Security Council?
So frankly, it's more important about what my American leadership, my American chain of command thinks than any of the, and this is, these are honorable people. I'm not sure if he meant it as a joke or not, but it's much more important what my civilian White House National Security Council chain of command thinks, more so than anybody else. And frankly, if they were concerned about me being able to continue my duties,
Of course.
they would have brought that to my attention. Dr. Hill stayed on for several more months, and we could continue to work to advance U.S. policy.
Okay. And during the times relevant of the committee's investigation, did you have any communications with Mr. Yarmouk or Danny Luke outside of the July 10th meeting?
I recall a courtesy note from Mr. Yermak within days of his return to July, in which he wanted to preserve an open channel communication, and I said, please feel free to contact me with any concerns.
And were you following this? There's sort of two tracks. Ambassador Taylor walked us through it during his testimony last Wednesday. He called it a regular channel, and then he called it an irregular but not outlandish channel with Ambassador Sondland and Ambassador Volker. Were you tracking the Sondland and Volker channel during this time period?
Yeah, so I'm trying to recall at which point I became aware of Ambassador. Certainly, I was aware of the fact that they were working together. Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, and Secretary Perry were working together to advance U.S. policy interests that were in support of what had been agreed to. But I didn't really learn, like I said, until the July 10th. Actually, there may have been a slightly earlier point. I recall a meeting in which Ambassador Bolton facilitated a meeting between Ambassador Volker and Ambassador Bolton in the June timeframe. And there may have been some discussion about this external channel, but
okay.
I frankly didn't become aware of these particular U.S. government officials being involved in this alternate track until July 10th.
Okay. And I think we had some discussion that, Mr. Giuliani was promoting a negative narrative about the Ukraine, and certain officials were trying to help the president understand that with Zelensky, it was a new day and Ukraine's going to be different. Is that your understanding?
That is correct. That is exactly what was being reported by the intelligence community, by the policy channels within the NSC, and the conservative voices of the various people that have actually met with him, including foreign officials.
And to the extent that you're aware of what Ambassador Sondland's goals were here and Ambassador Volker's goals were here, you think they were just trying to do the best they could and try to advocate in the best interest of the United States?
That is what I believed, and that is what I still believe, frankly.
And so to the extent Mr. Giuliani may have had differing views, they were trying to help him understand that it was time to change those views?
I think they were trying to bring him into the tent and have him kind of support the direction that we had settled on.
And you never conferred with Mr. Giuliani?
No,
You never had any meetings, phone calls, or anything of that sort?
I did not.
And did you have any?
I only know him as New York's finest mayor,
America's mayor.
America's mayor.
And did you have any discussions, communications during this relevant time period with the president?
I've never had any contact with the President of the United States.
My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.